I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we are taking a look at the resurrection with Dr. Gary Habermas. He is the Distinguished Research Professor of Apologetics and Philosophy at Liberty University at the School of Divinity, and the author of many books on the resurrection. So, Dr. Habermas, thanks so much for joining us today.
Nice to be with you, and of course I love the topic, so you picked a good one.
Yeah, you've done a lot of work on this for several decades. So I had seen all the work you've done, and I was very impressed with that. And then once I went back to try and get in touch with you again, I noticed that you'd come out with 3 more big volumes. So when is the 4th volume coming out of the series?
Well, the first one was, they were doing them eight months apart. So it was January of 24. I think it was August of 24, May of this year, 25, and the last one was supposed to be out in January. And for some reason, I still haven't gotten to the end of it. In fact, the editors don't even know. But the date has been moved back for the 4th volume from January 15th to August 15th of 26.
All right. I'll look forward to that one.
Volume 4.
Okay, so if you could just give the audience a brief background on your theological, ecclesiastical orientation, they know what sort of place you're coming from.
Yeah, well, I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I pastored for 7 years, and I started teaching way back in the Middle Ages, 1970, let me get this, 1976, I started teaching, and I taught Montana, I taught Detroit, and I came down to Liberty here in 1981 to start a master's program in apologetics, and I don't even know the date. I'm going to guess 10 to 15 years ago. I moved over from the master's program to the PhD program in theology and apologetics, what it was. This is the on-campus course, the residence course, and I've been teaching there ever since. I teach full-time in the PhD program. I don't teach any other course. I do a lot of other speaking and a lot of interviews like this one, but I only teach courses in the PhD program.
And so what is your denominational background?
I was raised in a German Baptist church, and I pastored in a United Brethren church, and I would say generally one or another Baptist type background. But I go to every kind of. I've probably spoken on or gone and spoken on the campuses of just about any denomination you could think of. And of course, also a number of dialogues with atheists, so I run the whole gamut. I don't judge what venue I'm speaking to. If they want me and I can work it out, I've usually tried to make it. So I'm kind of cosmopolitan. I don't look for any one denomination or church to go to or anything.
And so what led you to focus so much on the resurrection all these years?
Well, it's a long story, but I'll try to keep it brief. Some talk show hosts will say, "Let me guess, you're a good guy." I'm thinking, okay, where's this going? And he says, "You're a good guy. You probably did the resurrection because we know you've written 3 books on doubt. You probably did the resurrection to help the doubters that you're writing to because you speak to doubters a lot about the resurrection." And I said, well, sort of, but that's the end of the road. My study on the resurrection was because I was a doubter. And I went through doubts off and on for about 20 years. And after I got my PhD, way back in, let me think about this, 1976, ever since I finished that, I have been working in that field. But after my PhD, I say this so that people don't think I was a little kid or something, but after my PhD, I seriously considered becoming a Buddhist. Now, not classical Buddhism with meditation and the man that some Buddhists say we don't even know what he taught because we don't have any sources that are early enough to give his teachings. That comes from a Buddhist professor, by the way. Um, I was interested in a different kind of Buddhist message, the one that says Buddhism is the proper grounding for contemporary physics. It's the religion for physics. And that was a hot view in the 70s and 80s. And I went down that path for a while, and I got away from it. So the resurrection was an answer to my own doubt. But the problem was the resurrection made sense to me. First time I read somebody say, if Jesus is raised from the dead, he must be who he said he was, because if he's raised from the dead, that takes God. Even according to David Hume, the famous skeptic, you need God or an invisible agent for a miracle. So if God did it, why would God do it if he was a heretic? I thought, wow, I never heard that before. Here's the problem. I don't know anything about the resurrection. And from that time on, I dug in with both feet because I was answering my own questions. And after I'd been doing it for maybe 5 years, this shows you I'm an old guy, I had accumulated 1,700 note cards, resurrection note cards with complete bibliography. I didn't do it for anybody else. I didn't think I was going to publish. I did it for me. I hate to sound like so simple-minded, but everybody around me was like saying, I don't need evidence for my faith. I just believe. And I thought, oh, that's awful simple. If that's good for you, that's fine. But for me, it's just, I can't do with that. So that's why my doubts, and that's why the resurrection. And I finished doing my dissertation on the resurrection at Michigan State in 1976. They approved the topic.
All right. Okay, that's very helpful. So, just one basic question in terms of what the resurrection is,
Sure.
is that Jesus could already do absolutely amazing miracles in his natural original body. So, what is the core difference between his resurrection body and the body that he already had?
Okay, it's a very in-depth question, and I just got an answer I just got a question from a specialist in that kind of question just yesterday, and he wanted me to give him the short answer. I said, well, there's no short answer, but here's the two most popular views. Most scholars, I'll give you the general overview from the New Testament. Real skeptical scholars, they will let you use 7 of the 13 epistles written by Paul, and they're the 7 major ones. Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians. So right there you got 4. And then you flip to Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. They'll let you use any of those. They don't think they're inerrant, inspired, or anything. They're many times they're not Christians, they're skeptics or atheists. But they think Paul was a guy who had 2 feet on the ground. He was a good scholar. He was honest. He's telling you the truth. He might be wrong, but he truly believed what he said. He was an ethical person. And since Paul is seen as the leading author in the New Testament, so I get criticism all the time. Oh, you're crazy. You believe the Gospels are godly and the next thing to God, and they don't even know. I almost don't even deal with the Gospels. I mean, I've got 200 pages on the Gospel resurrection passages in my first book, but almost all my time is spent on Paul because that's where the skeptics do it. And here's the two views. Most skeptical scholars today will grant that Paul now, thinks that what he saw on the way to Damascus was a vision of Jesus, which was definitely bodily. It was a bodily appearance, but bodily in the sense of being probably some had to have some light elements, they would say, because Paul was blinded. But for the most part, they think Jesus was a body. They will emphasize that, critics, that Paul thought he was a body, but that he was less than the physical body, resurrection body portrayed in the Gospels. Okay. On the other view, and there's some new books that just came out that one of the most sophisticated books I've ever read. Just got published this year, and it's by James Ware, and he argues that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul's argument is definitely no different than the resurrection body in the Gospels. They're the same. And a growing number of scholars are going that way. So you either got a, I don't know how to say this, you got a, the first body is kind of like a, I don't want to say a non-body body, but it's not the body people think about. It's more of a real fine matter, but it's matter. And the other view is a physical body, but one that could go through things, appear and disappear. It was changed, and that's Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. Sorry for the long answer there, but the debate is not so much, it's on two levels. What did Paul think it was, and what does the appropriate scholar doing the talking think it was? And a scholar could say, what I just told you is what Paul said, but I take a different view. So, like any other subject, we differentiate from the subject we're talking about in our view. I can do a report on a political view that's not mine, but I could do a real accurate view on reporting that view, but I can hold a different position. And that's kind of what's going on in the New Testament. They tell you what Paul meant, and then they tell you where they are, if you want to know that, where they are.
Okay, but so Jesus could pass through walls, he could turn invisible. I mean, his body was indestructible, whereas his natural body was destructible. So those would be the key differences, or are there more?
Yeah, well, you can start with, real simply, there's a lot of evidence for an empty tomb. And I just did a brief survey a few years ago. I reported in the first of those 4 volumes where 80%, I tried to get scholars across the spectrum, skeptics, moderates, conservatives, and about 80%, and I didn't rig this thing so it would come to 80, but it came to 80.1 in my survey. That's just my survey. Believe the tomb was empty. Now, if you start with that, the tomb was empty. When the stone is rolled away, you see this in the Gospel of Peter, but nobody accepts the Gospel of Peter's late, but it's still popular some places. But except for that late book, in the New Testament, Jesus never walks out of the tomb after the stone is rolled away. He's rolled away. People go in, whether an angel or a woman or later a man, and there's no body there. And they're told that Jesus is raised, and they'll see him in Galilee or wherever. Appearances were different places. So I think when he rose from the dead in the tomb, he had to have moved through the rock and then return to whatever body he had. You know what I mean? Here's his body in the tomb. He, for lack of any decent language, he zaps through the rock and reassumes his, so he could do that. Later, when the disciples are inside a building, they don't tell you exactly, he's just there. So apparently he either came, a building is surrounded on all 4 sides. You don't open the door and walk in. He was just there. So I think he went through, how he did it we can debate, but I think he went through the rock. I think he went through the wood of the building, whatever, and he reassumed this shape. And the people take the light, let's call it the light body view, and the heavier body view. Those are the 2 popular views that they think Paul held. Sorry for the long explanation, but
no, that's good.
That question you ask is today, it's a really big issue.
Okay, so we're spending most of the time on the evidence for the resurrection, but it's really important to understand the theological significance. I've had people say, I talked to you, it's like, well, whether it happened or not, what's the big deal? And it's obviously a very big deal, so why is it so theologically significant? Yeah,
it's theologically different. Let me make a couple comments. You said, let me say it this way. you don't have to. You could be a person who thinks Jesus appeared in a physical body, pretty physical. I mean, you said it. His body he was born in, he died in. If that's awkward language, but he did die. His body died. He appeared in a body that in the New Testament over and over and over again is alive forevermore. So that's called eternal life. Okay, so his body's changed. But the one point I like to make is if you take let's say the real body view, although whenever I say his resurrection body, it's always transfigured, it's always changed. It's always changed. But if you take that changed body to mean a fairly palpable body, then you argue that the resurrection happened. But even if this is a very important point, even if the other side is correct, and Jesus appeared not as a spiritual body, nobody would have reached out to touch him and their hand went through his body. I mean, he was there, and they could see him from 10 different sides, however many disciples or whatever. Nobody sees their hand go through him. Both of the major views is that he had a body of sorts. All I'm going to say about that is if he was raised in the less than heavy view, the first view, he was still raised. So if that's the body he was raised in, over and over again in the New Testament, more than any other doctrine, almost 20 times, the New Testament says believers will be raised like Jesus was raised in a body like his. Paul says it really well in a book that critics readily accept, don't argue, Philippians 3:21. He said, not like we were sown in a vile body, but we will be raised in his spiritual body. But Paul uses the word soma, which is body in Greek. Paul could easily have said he was born in the flesh and died, but then he was raised as a beautiful spirit, and that's how we'll all be raised. Okay. But Paul doesn't say that. Paul doesn't say a glorious pneuma. That'd be a very easy change. A glorious spirit. He said we'll be raised in a glorious body, like Jesus. So, if you believe that believers think they will be raised like Jesus, it does make a difference what kind of body he had. But the point I want to make there is either view is very well evidenced. You don't have to know. This is hard. Yes, you're right. We should know and be able to discuss what kind of body. But either body, you're not talking hallucination in these cases. So either kind of body on Paul's view is a body. And if Paul somehow taught this light body view, and someday we'll be like that, if that's what the New Testament said, that's what Christians would believe. So what I mean is, either view is not going to upset the Christian view if that was the view taught in the New Testament. So the debate is about what did Paul mean? And I can go, in fact, in my first volume, the big book, it's almost 1,100 pages, on the resurrection, evidences. And then in the second volume, there in particular, both volumes, I treat this, well, I'll be funny with you. I call it a Jedi Jesus view. This first, less than a real physical body, I call Jedi Jesus, because in the Star Wars, I'm not super Star Wars fan, but I think people will get this. If you're a Star Wars fan, was it the third one? Which is the one with the little fuzzy bears running around, the Ewoks or whatever they were called?
I think that was the third one.
Third one? Okay. Do you remember at the end, the dark force, the dark planet, the Death Star, is destroyed, and Luke already knows Leia's his sister, and they're around the campfire. And Luke looks across the campfire, and he sees Darth Vader, who was, quote, converted. He had a deathbed conversion, right? He's converted on his deathbed, if you remember the story. Then there's Obi-Wan and the little Yoda, the little munchkin. All right, now he sees them, and they're plainly interacting with him. They're looking at him and smiling, and, they're talking to him. But if you look real carefully, you can see the woods through their bodies. That's sort of this less, well, let's call that the body light view. And you got the heavy body view is not the one he died in. It's been changed, but it's more, you could touch him. All right. Either view can be strongly evidenced. So that evidence isn't the point. He was raised, believers have eternal life, no matter which one you have. The question is, what view was Paul teaching? Now, I got to admit, I love this conversation, but this is the deepest, it's one of the deepest I've gotten into in, 300 interviews. So I appreciate you asking the question. I hope I'm not losing anybody of your audience by doing this. But that's why I call the lesser view Jedi Jesus. It's what Luke saw across the campfire. And let me say it again. If the New Testament says that's how Jesus was raised and that's how we'll be, believers would be happy. It's not a bad view. But then the other view, if you think, yeah, that's okay. In fact, most Christians think in the intermediate state right after death, we're going to be in that state. We're going to be without a body, but then the body comes later, the resurrection body like Jesus. But if there's a body later, then that's the one I want to go with. I want to go with the one that Paul's with. But Paul does have a Jedi Jesus phase. It's between death and the final stage that we call, last things and so on. A lot of details, but depends on which view you take. But the evidence question can work with either view.
All righty. Okay, that's good. That's helpful. Yeah, maybe we'll come back to some of these, but let's get into the evidence then. So this is really crucial. You've helped a lot of people with doing apologetics over the years. This is so central for that. So first of all, if you could talk about the difference between the minimal historical facts and the known facts before we get into the individual ones.
Would you like me to map that out, or to give some of the facts, or what would you like me to do?
Well, before we get into fact, just how do you categorize the difference between the two? What do those categories mean, known facts versus minimal historical facts?
I take it the majority of people who are going to argue for the resurrection, especially the ones that can be scholars, they can have doctor's degrees, but if maybe they're pastors in churches, these are the kind that speak in churches and so on. Most, I would say probably, it's hard to give differences. A lot of Christians would speak from the Gospels, and they're going to address Matthew 28, Mark 16, where there's no appearances, but Jesus was proclaimed to be risen, and the disciples are told, he'll see you in Galilee. So there's still appearances proclaimed. Luke 24, John 20 and 21, and the first 11 verses of Acts. That's what most people mean when they go to evidence, they go to the Gospels. The kind of skeptics that I frequently deal with, that I most often deal with, my debates, and I've had dozens, of different kinds. I mean, written, over the airwaves, in person. They're going to let you use Paul, like I said earlier. They often don't like the Gospels, but they like those 7 books in Paul. If you can make your case from Paul, you got it. If you can show 1 Corinthians 15 happened, you got it. Now, this book I just mentioned by James Ware called The Final Triumph, it's the whole book, and a very reputable publisher, Erdman's, a very scholarly publisher, I should say. Almost 500 pages are totally devoted to 1 Corinthians 15, period. And all scholars think that's fine. So you get the two groups together. Everybody will talk about 1 Corinthians 15. What's the view teach? Where do we go? What did Paul mean? And that's what the debate is. So I draw most of my data from Paul and other sources. I kind of argue like this. If the skeptics on the left will accept the sources, the New Testament ones, if they'll tell you which ones they accept, the conservatives on the right will definitely let you take those because they want those plus more, but they'll let you use those. So I usually use Paul. Now, I get blamed a lot. I get criticized a lot by more conservatives who say, you don't argue the Gospels. You only argue Paul. Now, I hate to do this, but let me show you this. Hold it up just so I can show people. This is volume 1. It's big. You could use it to hold your windows up and stop your doors. It doesn't even fit. I have professional shelves built in here, but it doesn't fit on the shelf. It's oversized. And on my scales, it weighs 5 pounds. Now, you probably don't think of a book, you don't think 5 pounds is odd until you pick up some of your big books and put them on the scales and they're way less than 5 pounds. Okay. In here, for people who say, but you don't like the gospel resurrection passages, I'll say, I beg to differ with you. I've used them in debates. I've used them many times, probably not as much as Paul, but I use them many times. And here's the key. In this book, I have over 200 pages on the 5 chapters I just mentioned. Matthew 28, Mark 16, Luke 24, John 20 and 21. It's the only gospel of 2 chapters. And those little 11 verses, first 11 verses in the book of Acts. I have 200 pages only on the resurrection passages in those books. And I'm trying to say they come alongside Paul, and together we have a great argument for the resurrection. That's how I work that out. I do my minimal facts argument for the people over on one side, and then I say, hey, the Gospels have some things to contribute for people over on the right side, my right, my left and my right. You know, political skeptics and conservatives. There's moderates in between. They're usually pretty fair about what text they'll let you use. But with their skeptics, if I'm going to debate, I'm going to usually use Paul. That doesn't mean that's all I'm going to use, but I'll use their favorite sources, those 7 books by Paul.
Okay, well, why don't we go for your 6 minimal historical facts then,
right.
starting with Jesus' death.
Yes, I often call these the 6+1, and I'll tell you why in a second. Minimal facts are 6 in number. And here's my 2 definitions for minimal fact. I will use facts that the phrase in scholarship is called multiply attested. Evidences that are multiply attested. I only use facts. This is the most important one for sure. There are many evidences for each of the 14 I use. Let me go back this way. Over on the critical side, I will use theirs because the conservatives will always let theirs be used. They just want more. So I want a lot of evidence that back up these 6. And secondly, this is a much lesser reason, and people misconstrue me all the time and say, oh, you say it's true because the skeptics grant you that. No. I'm saying the evidence is so good for it that step 2, and it's much less, it's not as strong as step 1 by a mile. By the way, the skeptics accept, by and large, usually, they accept the evidence I'm going to use. So these 6 facts are very well accredited. I think I argue, there's some overlap, but I have an average, I actually counted. Each of these 6 facts has an average of 14.7, about 15 independent reasons for it. And that's why the lesser fact, that's why the critics are involved. They're going to grant the evidence for you because if you're going to use Paul and a few other things, there's some things they'll use in the Gospels, but by and large, I'll give it to you. Okay, here's the 6. Jesus died by crucifixion, Roman crucifixion. The Romans crucified him. Secondly, The disciples had experiences a very short time later that they interpreted, that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. I could just say it real simply. They thought they saw Jesus alive. They thought they saw Jesus risen from the dead. Okay. Number 3, their lives were transformed. 3 and 4 can be made they work together. 3 is that their lives are transformed, and I never say the disciples were transformed and gave their lives for this teaching. We don't know that. We can't trace the martyrdoms of most of the apostles. They very well could have died for their faith. But I always say they were transformed to the point of being willing to die for their faith. Now you go, well, this willing thing bugs me. This is a critic. This willing thing bothers me. How do you know they were willing to die? They might have been in a tough situation. They didn't want to die, and all of a sudden they died. They couldn't stop it. The crowd got there. They were overcome. They're beat up, and they died. Here's how I know the disciples were willing to die. I tell people I don't have to read their minds. I read their feet. I see where they've gone. And when I get the geographical routes, especially of Paul, but when I get the geographical routes of a number of the early believers, why would you go into a city where you got beat up and almost killed? And why would you go back to the same city or a neighboring city where oftentimes we're told that people from that first city who tried to kill you came to the second city when they found out you came back? So why do you go back if you aren't willing to die? So I only say their lives are transformed to the point of being willing to die. Fourthly, this is crucial and very few people know it. The resurrection reports happened immediately. Now here's what the critic hears. Oh, I know what you're saying. It's predicted to Mark at plus 35 years later to plus 40 years later, and then it's narrated in Matthew, Luke, and John. That's what you're saying. You're saying early is the teaching of Mark, and there's not even appearances there. We're just told he was raised and he was going to appear. And you're going to wait for that till 65 AD, so you're about 35 years later. And I'll go, no. Yes, I will use that stuff, but that's not my definition of early. Here's the definition of early. If the Gospels start in about 65 to 70, Mark, Paul's epistles are much earlier, and that's one of the reasons why critics like Paul. In fact, they will admit he's the only eyewitness to a resurrection we have. And Paul's earliest epistle, according to most, is 1 Thessalonians, about 50 AD. Now, some go back to 48, but that's a pretty minority view. Let's just say 50. Now, if Jesus is crucified in 33, the two big years are, I said 33. The two most popular years are 30 and 33. If you go back to 30, which is the most popular year, 30 and 50 is 20 years away, if that makes sense. So, in Mark, we've gone 35 years. But Habermas, you said early. Yeah, I know I'm getting there. Now I get back to Paul, and Paul in 1 Thessalonians is where resurrection is reported, and 1 Thessalonians is plus 20. And if Jesus died in 33 AD, now it's plus, it's in 50 AD. I hope I said the words right. That's only 20 years away. If he died in 33 AD, that's only 17 years. We're getting smaller. But here's the point people miss. The New Testament is full, a few dozen, of what we call creedal traditions. They are oral testimonies that were taught, if not by the apostles themselves, during the apostolic times. And these go back, well, a lot of people don't put dates on them, but these are thought by many to go back to 30s AD. Now, let me give you one example. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following is the best known of these creedal statements. Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15, 3, I gave you what I was given. how that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, buried, rose again, according to the Scriptures, and appeared. And then he gives the longest list. Critics like to point out that in, like, telephone tag, how come the oldest books have the most appearances? Not so with this one. The longest list of appearances is in the earliest source, 1 Corinthians 15. But Paul said, it's not mine. I gave you what I was given. Okay. How soon? Well, if your listeners have heard of the Jesus Seminar, they are often thought to be, as a group, the most liberal group of skeptics and non-Christians. Many of them would probably say, I'm just saying what they would say about themselves. I can't say who they are internally. They took a vote on this, and they reject, by the way, 91% of the so-called red letter words of Jesus. They say Jesus never said them. He might have said 10 more percent, but even that is 81% rejected. They're pretty skeptical. And yet they think that 1 Corinthians 15, that report that Paul says I got from somebody else, that report, they think, either the creed itself, that's in the 1 Corinthians 15, what Paul gave them, or the component parts of the creed, the appearances. They believe they were in existence before Paul's conversion. Now think about that. If Jesus dies in, let's use roundabout, Jesus dies in 30 AD. Everybody, conservative and liberal, puts Paul's conversion about 2 to 3 years after the cross. So if Jesus died in 30 AD, Paul becomes a Christian in 32 to 33. 3 years later, that's either 35 or 36 AD, he goes up to Jerusalem and interviews the two big-named eyewitnesses, Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and we're told that they discussed the gospel. Paul went back a second time, Galatians 2, same book. And the apostles gave Paul and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. They agreed with them on what the gospel is. They didn't change Paul's view. That report at 35 or 36, most people, like Ware, this new book by James Ware, they say that report from Paul and the eyewitnesses, now you're up to 3 eyewitnesses, Paul, Peter, James. Paul reports Peter and James. All was there by 35 to 36. So here's the force of the early argument. Yeah, but look at the Gospel of John. That's 65 years later. Why'd you start with John? Why don't you start with Mark? Okay, fine. That's 35 to 40 years later. That's still not early. Okay, fine. Why don't you go back to Paul? That everybody grants. That's 50. Oh, okay, now we're at 20 or maybe 17, but more likely 20 years later. Okay. But now you have these early creedal confessions where there's many of them. One of the best known ones in Scripture is Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. That's an early creedal statement from this early period. And if that stuff was noised around at the beginning, you've got this stuff from 5 years after the cross would be easy. The Jesus Seminar think it was there 2 to 3 years before Paul's conversion, before 2 to 3 years later. That's early. The last, that's 4, fact 4. 5 and 6 are real fast. 5 and 6 are James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, both of whom are skeptics, both of whom are unbelievers, an insider, family member, an outsider, a Pharisee that hated Christianity and was taking people to prison over it. And they both become Christians because they believe they saw the risen Jesus. So there's my 6. The empty tomb can kick some things in. It's well evidenced. But people just blame me a lot and say, oh, you say the empty tomb is one of your minimal facts. I have never said that in print. I've never said it. I don't know where they get this. I think maybe because I see the empty tomb as good evidence. But there's a lot of things that have good evidence and aren't part of my 6 facts.
So you say the empty tomb is a known fact. So what's the difference here between a known fact and a minimal fact?
Excellent. You've been doing some study there. I appreciate that. Yeah, I start out, you asked me about the 6 facts, so I went right to the 6. I start out with a list of 12 that are almost as solid The second 6 are almost as solid as the first 6 I just gave. They lag behind them, and according to the way I do evidence. If I were a detective, um, and I'm doing something for a crime, I would have 6 kinds of evidence for which I have many evidences of what's going on here. I have 6 more that are not quite as good, but if I'm allowed in the court of law to give all 12, I'll give all 12. But the ones I call the minimal facts are only 6. The empty tomb is part of the 12. So you're right, it's part of the 12, but I've never called the empty tomb. If I did it in an interview, it was a misstatement. But I've never said it in print or in a debate that the empty tomb is one of the minimal facts. Does that help?
Okay, right. And is this just your terminology, or do other scholars that study the resurrection, do they use these same terms?
Well, many people are starting to use the minimal facts phrase, and they're using that.
But they got it from you, though.
I'm not trying to say, yeah, they got it from me, but I'm pretty sure I was the first one to use it. Now,
Okay.
I'll give you the testimony. I'll answer your question by using a Christian. The person I'm going to cite is a Christian, but they would rather talk about all the Gospels and not just limit it to 6. So they're saying, golly, I'm glad Gary thinks Jesus is raised from the dead, but I sure wouldn't limit myself to 6. I think he just is leading people astray. We should give him the whole bit of the Gospels. And that's why I say there's 200 pages on just the resurrection chapters alone here, because I've always said that. Way before this person's criticized me, I've said this back in the 80s, back when I've debated atheists. So in other words, they're not on my side with using just the minimal facts. And yet they say this. This person says, the minimal facts it is so widely used. I think they use the phrase, it's the almost unanimous view of apologists today. Apologists and people who aren't really apologists, but they're learning from the apologists and they're getting their own method down. If they're using the minimal facts argument, this person says, it's almost like they're saying, darn, I wish they'd use a little, I'm happy for that message, but I wish they'd use more because we need more. But man, about 9, they said almost unanimous are using that minimal facts approach. I don't survey that question, so I don't know if I know it's very popular today, but I'm not prepared to say how popular it is.
Okay, so I think the disillusionment and despair of the disciples, that's one of your known facts. Which is, that's what you would expect after Jesus dies, right?
Yes.
So
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Just to be clear, despair is part of the second 6, not the 6 minimal facts, but still good.
Right. It's a known fact.
Now, I have reports. It's clear from the Gospels, if I can use those, and I have 200 pages there. It's one of the reasons it's not a minimal fact. It's not as solid, but I think it's really good. And I argue 2 ways. The Gospels, and we can get some from the other texts too, outside the Gospels, show that these guys were initially scared. And, I have a book on my shelf, and that Saturday after the crucifixion, it's often referred to Black Saturday, because Black Saturday is a traditional Christian approach to bummer. That was a really bad day for everybody because these guys walked away from their nets and their tax collecting and whatever else they were doing. They periodically got back with their wives and kids, but when Jesus was moving around, he was an itinerant preacher. When Jesus moved, they moved. And they gave 3 years of their life. How would you feel on Saturday when you have this vision that poof, it's all gone awry? What do you do with that? Well, so the texts say, let me cite John. John's not the favorite gospel of everybody, but John chapter 20. The women go to the tomb, and what are the men doing? Oh, well, they must have accompanied women to the tomb. After all, if they crucified Jesus, they could be out to crucify his followers. No, the men didn't follow women. First of all, in all fairness, it was a women's job, that there was a division of labor, and that in that world, and women were responsible for burying. So, yeah, the men can say they were just doing their job. But these are rough times. This might be my wife. This might be my sister. I don't want these people. No. John says the men were hiding for fear of the Jews in John 20. So, however you take that, we have enough data. Here's my second argument. I think this one's even stronger than the text. Hiding after your best friend has been murdered and you did not expect it to happen, and one thing led to another, and Thursday night, Friday, Pilate, Herod, boom, boom, beaten, carried across, crucified, beaten up. What's going on? And some of them are hiding even then, right? Peter denies the Lord 3 times. They did have that kind of denial. But I think the maybe stronger reason, or just as strong, is psychology. How many people would lose their best friend after 3 years of total devotion, walked away from their businesses, fishing, tax collecting, so on, walked away from all of it, and now they're hiding because they're men. They're more likely to be killed than the women are, so we'll just stay in here and hope nobody knocks on our door. It's a normal psychological reaction if your best friend, and not just your best friend, the founder of the belief system that you base heaven on, eternity. Imagine there's discussions on Saturday. Guys, what do you think? Is there any hope here? What do we do? Our master's gone. What hope do we have? Saturday had to be a bad day. Had to be Black Saturday. So I have the 2 arguments for despair. There's the textual argument. Peter denied Jesus. The disciples are hiding. There's the textual argument, and there's the psychological argument. You can't avoid the normal psychological. What would you be doing? Going to the party the next day? So that's how I argue, and I do that in the book because I do the other 6. I do all 12 of the facts. I do the 6, but I back up and I do the other 6 too. So I do all 12. And then I move to the larger group and spend 200 pages on the Gospels.
Okay, then, and how would you make your best case if you're a skeptic? You want to steel man their best case interpretation of given the 6 minimal historical facts. What would be their best case? A hallucination? I mean, something psychological?
I'm not. Now, right there at the end, you threw me for a loop. Are you asking which natural theory is the strongest?
Yeah. What's the
best
natural theory?
How do I use the minimal facts and get a resurrection?
No, what's the best non-miraculous theory to account for the transformation of the disciples and everything else?
Well, first of all, I'll answer that question sort of an historical look. Where are we right now? Where are skeptical scholars? They used to, going back to the 1800s in Germany, that was the heyday. The liberal, it's not my dirty name for them, it's their name for their movement. It's called German liberalism. And they came up, Albert Schweitzer's famous Quest for the Historical Jesus, very famous book, is the descriptive book of where all these guys are. And that's the heyday of the natural theories. You know what? Nobody rises from the dead. What I think is, and I give my theory, then the next liberal comes along. This is hilarious. I've got 3 chapters on it. I've got, let me think about this. I think I've got over 100 pages on just the German liberal movement. And whenever they come along, they don't just say, oh, no, I think I'm going to take this theory. They don't do that. After you give your theory, and we're German liberals, you give your theory against the resurrection. I come along and I go, oh, man, Dennis is crazy. He's a friend of mine. Don't get me wrong. We go fishing together. But he's all wet on this one. Let me give you the right theory. I give that one. Next one that comes along, I don't know where Gary went to school, but he's cracked up on this one. And they take these major theories. Probably the most successful one was hallucination. David Strauss wasn't the originator of it, but he was the best known name associated with it. He was writing at Tübingen, the arguably most scholarly of the German universities, in 1835. In his Life of Jesus, he argues for hallucinations. Um, but he develops his theory until the 1860s. In 1865, he does a new version of it called the Life of Jesus for the German People. The first one was called Life of Jesus. Life of Jesus for the German People. And he develops this a little bit more. He takes hallucination theory. And now, earlier I was talking about Jedi Jesus, which is kind of a wispy, I hate to use that word, but, well, when Luke looks across the fireplace, those guys were pretty wispy, but they were really there. They were really there. They're looking at him. But a guy named Theodor Keim, 1872, did the major critique of David Strauss and said hallucination's crazy. And he gave that early version of that Jedi Jesus view, which has to be one of the most popular views today. Jesus was really raised, but not in a palpable eating fish and bread body. So the Gospels are usually rejected, Paul's accepted, and Jesus truly appeared, and Christians have eternal life for following him. I mean, the message follows with the less than physical Jesus. Okay. I would say the resurrection, his hallucination theory that Keim went after, Theodor Keim, the German who went after Strauss, the one he disproved, that he's given credit for disproving, is probably, if you're going to pick a theory, it's probably your best bet, hallucinations. But I will tell you today, almost no critical scholar, I've been saying this a lot. Someday somebody will write to me and say, hey, have you thought about this guy? Almost no critical scholars today who don't believe the resurrection, they will say, oh, any of the naturalistic theories work because there's no supernatural. But they don't pick one. If you forced them to, they might go hallucination. But today, here's the main thing. They all work because they're all against the supernatural. And that's where I am. I'm against the supernatural, Now, I don't want your listeners to quote me. I'm quoting like I'm David Strauss in the 19th century. Today, virtually no scholar, and I'll complete that thought right here, almost none will take a single theory and stick with it. So if they're right, they win, and there's no resurrection. And if they're wrong, they lose, and the resurrection's still on the table. They do not it's past the day. The refutations are so strong, at least that's what I think the reason is. All right. Here's the second volume on refutations. That's volume 2 of the set. I do all these series, including both Strauss and Keim, the no resurrection, the light body, the Jedi Jesus view. I do them all. But today, I think what shows you that even the hallucination theory has hit the rocks is that very few people will say, it's the hallucination theory. I'm sure there was no resurrection. I'm sticking with my guns, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. That's what the scholars used to say. 19th century, and even now. The two best-known guys who took a single view, who were bold enough to do it, they both died in the last 5 years. One is Gerd Ludemann, an atheist German New Testament scholar. He takes hallucination. He took it. He's passed away. And John Shelby Spong, the famous pastor, but he's running some academic circles, and he took a different view. It's a little like hallucination, but it's a lot not like hallucination. He came up with his own. He and a few other people did their own thing. But what my point is, those two guys were willing to take one view and leave it. Now that they've died, John Dominic Crossan, by the way, a good friend of mine. I mean, he's a friend of mine. I think he would say that about me. We get along great. But he says, I don't like the naturalistic theories. He specifically says it. Well, I mean, what he says is, I don't take one. I think that's about the same thing. I don't take one. Now, I personally think the view he takes is naturalistic. He doesn't think it is, so whatever. But he says he doesn't take those old things from the 19th century or the new renditions of them later. Today, it's pretty much just to say, I don't like it. It's supernatural. And so I have to come along and talk about what do I say about the view that I'll frame the view this way. I don't need a naturalistic theory because there's no supernatural. That's not a theory. I mean, that's an overall worldview thing. It's not a specific theory how the disciples were mistaken. So I would go one of two ways. I would either say, time out. I've given you umpteen evidences for the resurrection, and you simply try to blow it away because you're a naturalist or a materialist. You don't believe there's anything supernatural in the world, including God's existence. You don't believe those things. Instead of saying my 10 reasons or 20 reasons are no good, time out. I'm going to give you an easy assignment. Why don't you give me just 5 knockout proofs? Proofs are used like high probability. Why don't you give me 5 really strong reasons why materialism or naturalism are true? Tell you what they're going to say. Oh, that's not what this debate's about. I don't have to prove my view. Whoa. So you just want me to keep going on evidence, 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 and you want to just say, no, there's nothing like that in the world. Where do you get your view of the world? Stop. Prove it. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking, and that's how the thing goes. The other argument I use is the other end of the scale. I use near-death experiences. And right now, I've had some major publications, 2 of them with a secular press that calls themselves the #1 academic press in the world. When I did my first article 10 years ago on NDEs, I argued that I had counted 300 evidential NDE cases. When I wrote my third article, it's not out yet, but I just sent it in this year to the publisher, early 2025. That number is up to 500 evidential cases.
So what constitutes an evidential NDE case?
Well, there's all kinds. I divide the evidence into 5 categories. I'll do it if you want, but I divide them into 5. But there's one book alone that gives 48 cases where, in terms of the machines we have, and that's all we have, a lot of people, the skeptics trusted these machines. Oh, yeah? Well, why don't you show me some cases where their brain and heart aren't working? Now you can show it. And one book has 48 cases of what I would call flat brain, flat heart cases. And here's how it works. If you have a cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation, that means it's truly a cardiac arrest. There are kinds where you don't die with it. You can talk. We all know people who go to the hospital and find out they're in the middle of a heart attack. But if you have the kind with ventricular fibrillation, your heart stops. In 14.5 to 20 seconds, you're brain dead. So if your heart dead and 20 seconds later, you see something across the field. I'm just making something up. You're in a room with no lights, no windows, and the guys come in and they're working on you, CPR and everything. And during that time, let's say it takes them an hour to resuscitate you. But during that time, you go, hey, guys, I don't know why you brought me back. Some of them are mad. They're slapping the doctor's hands when they bring back. And they'll go, there's a car accident over there. Check it out. Red car, green car. And that one guy's really dumb. He went through the stop sign. All right, I have a police report. Let's just say the guy, I'm going to make it easy. The guy died at 2 o'clock. He's revived at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The accident happened at 2:20, and it was pretty much settled, and they moved the cars away by 2:50. But you were out with no head, no brain or heart through the whole time. What are you doing with consciousness when you have no neurology? Oh, I don't know. Maybe there's some part of your body that does that. The joke is we don't know anything that does. And those machines used to be your friends. Used to say, well, give me the flat heart, flat brain cases. Now we have many of them, and they don't want to talk about it anymore. So I'll go to NDEs, which is plenty of evidence, and then I'll argue backwards. If there is an afterlife, why aren't you listening to my multi-point evidence for the resurrection? Because, let me remind you, the resurrection argument is at its core an afterlife argument. If you had a proof that Buddha rose from the dead, that would be an afterlife argument. It's in that category. And you go, well, that doesn't happen. There's not like that stuff in the world. And I already asked you, prove your view. I can't. See, even Bertrand Russell, a famous atheist, I mean, I know I'm rattling off here like crazy. That's how I am in class. One of my colleagues called me a machine gun mouth. I can go a mile a minute. But Bertrand Russell, who was maybe the best known philosophical atheist, I think he died in 1971, but from Oxford, when asked could he prove God, he said, no. Can you disprove God? And he said, well, ask the question a different way. No, I can't disprove God. Okay. Then on what grounds can you claim to be a naturalist or a materialist? And there's better days he called himself an agnostic, but sometimes use agnostic, sometimes use atheist. If you can't prove your view, don't criticize me for having reasons, And so if they can't prove their view, I think they have to get up on the same level with the theists that want to argue this way. We have plenty of reasons. You may not agree with my reasons, but you don't get 1,100 pages by whistling in the dark. Oh, sorry, I held the wrong book up. It's the first one on evidences. But so I think NDEs reopen the case for resurrection. Now, they're not as good as, the strength of NDEs is the evidence is modern, it's scientific, it's extremely strong. The only weakness is you have an afterlife, but you don't have eternal life. What if it ends in 10 years? What if it ends in 20 years? Oh, we just found out it lasts for 100 years. That's wonderful. But when that 100 years comes, we blink out of existence or what? The resurrection is stronger in this sense. We've got really good evidence. But if we're going to be raised like Jesus, if believers are going to be raised like Jesus, Jesus promised us we'd be with him for eternity. Now you go, well, he could be wrong. Yeah, but then God would be raising a heretic from the dead. And how come he's the only founder of a major world religion who's been believed to be raised from the dead with evidences? Why him? So, long story. Sorry for just going on. There was a lecture, not an answer to a question.
Okay, that's good. That's good. I think the NDEs, the veridical NDEs, are so important. So we'll have a link to that book that has the 48 cases. So how about this? I've heard you talk about this before. You already talked about this a little, but over the last several decades, how has the scholarly consensus been? How in the academy, people that study the New Testament, how have their views on the resurrection changed?
Pretty much I already outlined that, so I can just hit the high points. Do you mean skeptics? Because there are conservatives there too in the high.
Right. Yeah, the conservative academics, we know where they're going to land, but the skeptics.
The skeptics are going to give you the 7 books of Paul. Again, they don't think they're an errant or something, but they think he was a real scholar who knew his stuff, trained in school. He called himself a Pharisee. He had the best education at that time. Book of Acts, whether you like it or not, the book of Acts says he studied under Gamaliel. That would be like saying, today, that would be like, oh, I got my PhD with Karl Barth or somebody like that, some huge name. And you'd say, well, that doesn't mean he liked my view, but he thought it was pretty good because he passed my dissertation. So Paul studied with Gamaliel. He's smart. He doesn't lie. He can be wrong. He's opinionated, but he used to be on the other side. Now he's a believer. I'll take Paul. And I only basically, I'll use verses from the other 7 books, but I basically only use 1 Corinthians 15 and Galatians 1 and 2. And they give those chapters, don't even argue. They don't even argue with you. Now they might clarify, well, yeah, but you're taking a little license, but I'm still using their chapter. Today, they'll give you Paul, they'll call him, now the bad news is they'll say he's the only eyewitness for a resurrection appearance. The good news is he's an eyewitness of a resurrection appearance. So I'll give you that. They'll argue with you or not. Like I said, many times they don't pick naturalistic theories. They're not in today. Naturalistic theories aren't in. They'll just say that's not the world I live in. So I think the believer is either going to, and again, this is just a quick review. You're either going to have to argue before the fact with what kind of a world this is. Like, for example, is there a Big Bang? Yeah, it's almost unanimous there's a Big Bang. What was before that? Well, that's the point. We don't know what's before it. but it just came out of nothing, right? Does something come out of nothing? And C.S. Lewis says, a great one-liner, if there ever was a time when nothing existed, nothing would exist now. So you push them on their atheism, naturalism, materialism, or you go to the other end of the spectrum and talk about positive evidence, do NDEs. I don't think they can get it. I've had some of the best-known skeptics anywhere tell me, I don't want to talk about that subject. And I got upset with this one guy because he claims he could disprove all this. He's very well known. He claimed he could disprove all this stuff. He's an atheist. And I said, well, let's talk about NDEs. He goes, I don't want to. Well, come on. Give me a day in the sun here. We've been doing my evidence the whole time. What do you do about NDEs? Don't want to talk about it. I said, why? Because you might get too close to religion? Because you might get religion? Because you might come to believe in an afterlife? Don't want to talk about it. And it just kind of hit me the wrong way. Like, we sit here and I'm giving you data. Now, you're giving me your views against it. But when I go, time out, let's talk about something modern and good. I could also talk about double-blind prayer experiments that have been written up in medical journals, secular medical journals, because these things they work. There's healing cases with pre and post MRIs, CAT scans, etc. Craig Keener's stuff and many others. There's some cases that are really good. What do you do with miracles? What do you do with answers to prayer? What do you do with NDEs? Now we're getting a religious picture. Oh, and I almost forgot. What do you do with fine-tuning and intelligent design? Well, that's not an argument for Christianity. No, it isn't, but it's an argument for the beginning of it. If I have intelligent design and fine-tuning, I can start talking about God. If I have NDEs, I can start talking about the resurrection. And I'll just say to the guy in a debate, I'll say, just give in. Your worldview is caved in. Right now, there's a retreat from what we would call classical atheism. There's a bit of a retreat. And I can only say it so long, and I go back to my work because I've got too much to do to worry about a person who doesn't want to, quote-unquote, play the game.
Right. Okay, one last question. A lot of people that I hear from, they focus on, well, whatever we read in scriptures was just made up. Whatever was going on there, we can't really trust what the Bible says, and it's all a power play. They make up the resurrection story and everything else because they want to start a religion and have power, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, that's a good approach, but let me tell you, those guys are usually, they're not all this way, but they call themselves, this isn't a derogatory term, at least I don't think it is, they call themselves mythicists. And they believe that that to use anything in the New Testament is a bad move because you're using prejudiced data. You're the whatever group you want to. I'm leery to use anything because there's so many views today in this country on so many subjects. You're on this side, and you want to quote all the guys on your side, but you won't quote the other guys. You know, that kind of comeback. But what they want to tell you, they know you've got good data because when you dialogue with them, they can't answer it. So how they answer it is, it's all Christian. You're a prejudice. Well, let me just tell you, most critical scholars, if they have a university position, Bart Ehrman says he knows thousands of people. The well-known North American skeptic and sometimes atheist, calls himself atheist. He says he knows thousands of skeptics, and he said, he said, to my knowledge, you don't get a position in a state university if you think Jesus never lived. He said, all the guys that are in the game, all the football teams, they don't talk like minor leaguers. And you guys who don't believe Jesus lived, you're a minor leaguer. You're not a scholar. You don't have credentials. Quit talking like one. He does say that there's two. There's two well-known scholars who are mythers, but only two that he knows of, and they've got good degrees. But everybody else, the ones with the loudest mouths and talk the most, don't have those credentials. And the critics that we've been talking about for this whole show, they decry those people. In fact, Bart Ehrman spends 20 pages on them in his book, Did Jesus Exist? Goes off on them. Says they have stupid arguments. He calls their arguments howlers. At least he's criticizing one of them. Howlers, which is an argument that I call ha 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 ha. That's what he calls their argument. Now you could say, well, I'm sorry. I may not be as smart as Bart, or I might not have a PhD, but I might be right. And I go, okay, good. You have the same right everybody else does. Give me your evidence. Your prejudice. Great. Let me tell you how Bart Ehrman, the atheist, answers that objection. He goes, I don't think the Gospels are very reliable, but I think there are reliable things in the Gospels. So when I use some of those things, don't criticize me if I have reasons for the things I accept. And then he gives this illustration. If I'm doing a book on the Revolutionary War, and I get a chance to interview George Washington, am I going to say, no thanks, I don't want to interview you because you're a colonial and you're prejudiced? I know, but I was an eyewitness. I said you're prejudiced. I know, but I've got a story to tell. I was the Major General. Enough. I don't take your, because you're on the, and Bart says, I may not take all the American Revolutionary War stories, but if I have a chance to interview George Washington, of course I'm going to. And of course, it also means if he has a chance to do what Paul did and go to Jerusalem and interview Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and of course he's Paul, that's the big three. Of course he's going to go there and interview him. And that's why Paul went to Jerusalem. Why? Because he was a good researcher. He studied under the top guys. He knows how to do research. And so even the critics go off on him, the scholars, the PhDs. But they still run their mouths, and they're the most verbal on internet. They sound off all the time it's not true, not true, not true. But they're talking to their own crowds. Every once in a while, I'm not saying they don't get a convert, but I don't know any good arguments for it. I don't know how they would deal with these, with this data. And if they're unbelievers, if they're naturalists or materialists, I'd use those two arguments on them too. I'd go, time out, show me your worldview is correct. I bet you're going to get a silly answer. And the other one I would do is, let's talk about near-death experiences, because if there's an afterlife, you're out in the cold. In fact, I'll tell you this, in a recent survey taken only among atheists and agnostics, they're the only survey takers, atheists and agnostics. Here's the question. Do you believe in an afterlife/heaven? 32% of them said yes. That's 1/3. But here's the problem. Their worldview doesn't demand it. It's more like they like a good story. They hope it happens to them. Like Bart Ehrman said, I understand he said this. I've not read the book where he says it, but on good grounds, he said, I don't believe in hell because I think it's unethical. Well, we'd have to debate that. But he says, I would like to think there's a good heaven, but I don't believe it. I don't believe it, but I'd like to think there's a good heaven. I think that's those 32%.
Right.
I hope there is. So that's how I would talk to the mythers. I'd say, how do you ground your naturalism? And secondly, what do you do with near-death experiences? And I think the resurrection is going to get them in the middle, because if God is the beginning, if the Big Bang started it, I'm not using my theory, I'm using their theory. If the Big Bang started it, what are you going to do with the person, force, whatever you want to say, that caused the Big Bang? Didn't leap out of, a vacuum. And what do you do with the NDEs? That one especially hurts, because if there's an afterlife, then they've got to think, I don't know, I'm just guessing, they've got to think about, man, if I have to, I've done some things I'm not real happy about, I don't want to face, I don't know what they're going to think. But if there's an afterlife, that's a serious issue. I don't think it's negative, I think it's good. If 32%, 1/3 of atheists and agnostics say, yeah, I'd like to live forever.
Yeah,
remember that old song? Remember the song years ago, I Want to Live Forever, the rock song? I Want to Live Forever. Maybe it was a theme song to a movie, but it's nice to live forever. It'd be nice to have a nice life. But if you can't argue away from it, that's a big pillar against your view. So anyway, that's a great question at the end. because there are those guys, even though the scholars on either side of the two resurrection views I gave you, it's not, what Paul was thought to believe was our dialogue. Neither side thinks much of anything. And, Bart Ehrman asked him, how come none of you guys have a position in a university? If you're so bright and everything you write in self-published books, because they can't get published. I mean, they don't get published, with almost no exceptions, they don't get published in major presses. There are exceptions, but almost not. How come you're not, if you know so much, and there are two, he says, that are really well accredited, but how come you're not in a state university teaching? Oh, hadn't thought about that,
Okay. Well, that's a good place to stop then. So I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been with Dr. Gary Habermas discussing the resurrection. So we'll have links to his books.
Thank you.
So Dr. Habermas, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And I will say something. I almost never get into interviews this deeply, but I give you credit. Right from the get-go, you put me onto that question of where are we today, and I was doing this Jedi Jesus versus the full body view. I never start interviews like that because people don't want that much. They lose people in those discussions. But you started there, and I was happy to do it. And I think your questions today were fantastic. And you didn't just start with the first bang. There were a bunch of bangs after that, all the way to the end, and you didn't even let the mythers go at the end. So great job. I was happy to be on with you, Dennis. Appreciate it.
All right, great. Okay, peace to everyone. I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at thecharge.info@gmail.com. Please check out our other videos. Don't forget to hit like and click subscribe.